Okay, welcome everybody to a new program of At Home with Theosophy. This program that will last for about 6 or 7 weeks. We'll see how fast we can go through all the book. Will be based on a very interesting subject, and not only the subject but the book itself, which is called Karma. Karma by Annie Besant. The word karma is quite well known today. In the encyclopedia, in one of the encyclopedias, I think it was a Britannica, it is said that the first time that the word karma was used in English among the wider public was through the publications of the Theosophical Society. So the society has been instrumental in spreading this idea, and actually both Madame Blavatsky and her teachers, the Mahatmas, said that this was a fundamental idea to understand because it could change the way we relate to the world, to life, to ourselves and others. Now, even though the word is quite well known at this point, the understanding of karma is not necessarily very deep. Many people just think of karma in very similar terms to the idea of a god that punishes the wrongdoings and rewards the good doings. Some other people think of karma as a kind of mechanical law of action and reaction, which from a certain point of view we can understand karma in that way, but it's not quite like that. So we are going to explore through this book a quite deep and I think illuminating concept of karma and how this can help us relate to life, as I said, in a different way. So we are going to do as we have been doing in the past, going through some excerpts from the book, and then at the end we will have time for questions and answers or comments. So let us start with a quote that Annie Besant uses at the very beginning of the book. This quote is from the Mahatma letters, from letters that were sent by Blavatsky's teachers to some early members of the Theosophical Society, some English members. And the quote says, "Every thought of man, upon being evolved, passes into the inner world and becomes an active entity by associating itself, coalescing, we might term it, with an elemental, that is to say, with one of the semi-intelligent forces of the kingdoms. It survives as an active intelligence, a creature of the mind's begetting, for a longer or shorter period proportionate with the original intensity of the cerebral action which generated it. Thus, a good thought is perpetuated as an active, beneficent power, an evil one as a maleficent demon. And so man is continually peopling his quarantine space with a world of his own, crowded with the offspring of his fancies, desires, impulses and passions, a current which reacts upon any sensitive or nervous organization which comes in contact with it, in proportion to its dynamic intensity. The Buddhists call this skandha. The Hindu gives it the name of karma. The adept, the enlightened being, evolves these shapes consciously. Other men throw them off unconsciously." So this was written by the Master K.H. So Annie Besant begins with this quote and says, "No more graphic picture of the essential nature of karma has ever been given than in these words. If these are clearly understood with all their implications, the perplexities which surround the subject will for the most part disappear, and the main principle underlying karmic action will be grasped. They will therefore be taken as indicating the best line of study, and we shall begin by considering the creative powers of man. All we need as preface is a clear conception of the invariability of law and of the great planes of nature." So according to Annie Besant, that quote from the Mahatma letters, is encapsulating the essence of what karma is. And as you see, there is mention to our thinking producing a kind of energy, a kind of force, and that force influencing people, objects, and circumstances around. So the book will be to a large extent an attempt at explaining this particular quote in a deep way, because as Annie Besant says there, is really encapsulating the essence of how karma works. We normally don't read in books how is it that karma happens. When there is an explanation or a mention about this law, the law is stated, but in very few occasions there is any kind of development as to how this law acts. So that's what we are going to see. And Annie Besant says that the two first points that we have to understand is the idea of a law, what a law is, and the theosophical concept of the different planes that exist in the universe, not meaning that the universe is composed not only of the physical dimension that we know of, but also of subtler or not so concrete dimensions. So she starts with the invariability of the law. She says that we live surrounded by laws that we cannot break is a truism. Yet, when the fact is recognized in a real and vital way, and when it is seen to be a fact in the mental and moral world as much as in the physical, a certain sense of helplessness is apt to overpower us, as though we felt ourselves in the grip of some mighty power that, seizing us, whirls us away whither it will. So the first point that she says is, we know that there are physical laws. We cannot jump to the moon. We cannot do certain things on the physical plane that go against the physical laws of nature. Now, in the theosophical view, there are also mental laws, emotional laws, spiritual laws, which according to Besant are as immutable as the physical laws. Now, she says that if we really think of this, there may be a sense of determinism, what in philosophy is called determinism. You know, science is possible because you can determine what is going to happen when you do a certain thing. Of course, this is being challenged at the level of the quantum world. It seems that the quantic aspect of nature, the very small aspect of nature, is not deterministic. But for all purposes of practical purposes, are dealing with the world from the scientific point of view seems to be pretty deterministic. I know that if I throw a ball with this strength in this direction, I can calculate where it is going to fall. So when we think of the mental world, the laws that rule our thinking and the effect of our thinking, or the laws that rule our way of feeling and the effects of the feeling, or even the spiritual world, when we think that these worlds are also under immutable laws, as the Theosophical teachings propose, we may have this sense that the whole universe is deterministic and that we are just slaves of these laws. But she says the very reverse of this is in reality the case. For the mighty power, when it is understood, will obediently carry us whither we will. All forces in nature can be used in proportion as they are understood. And there is a quote, "Nature is conquered by obedience, and her resistless energy are at our bidding as soon as we, by knowledge, work with them and not against them." In the mental and moral worlds, as much as in the physical, results can be foreseen, planned for, calculated on. Nature never betrays us. We are betrayed by our own blindness. In all worlds, increasing knowledge means increasing power, and omniscience and omnipotence are one. So she is saying two important concepts here. One, that if there is an immutable law and we can understand how that law works, then we can learn how to manipulate this law, if we want to put it that way, so that we can do whatever we want to do. So for example, there is the law of gravitation, there is the law of aerodynamics, and because we understand these two laws, we can make a huge aeroplane that is really heavy, we can make it fly. So even though the laws of nature seem to be against, or at least the law of gravitation seems to be against the possibility of flying, because we understand how gravity works, we understand how aerodynamics works, then we can make an aeroplane fly when that could not seem possible. So by obedience to the laws, by working with the laws and learning how to use them, then we can produce something that seems to be impossible. So she says that the same can be thought of the mental world and the emotional world, all these other dimensions of the universe. And she says that in the same way that you can calculate certain results on the physical plane, you can do it on when we are talking about our mental aspect or the emotional aspect. And we have to remember here that there are two aspects to nature, one that is mechanical, the other that is creative. What is creative is what is related to our consciousness, to our awareness. The more our awareness is entangled in matter, the more this creativity is lost, because it gets more and more under the rule of the mechanical rule of matter. So on the astral or the emotional plane, the mental planes, they are also made of matter, which follow very specific laws. So from that point of view, also, we can learn how to work through this kind of matter to produce certain results. This, for example, in the case of adepts, meaning people who have a deep knowledge of how all these different worlds work, and that have a great skill at dealing with them, adepts can even precipitate or materialize objects because they know how to generate from the mental plane, from an idea, how to develop a real object. And there are many examples of this, or if not many, there are examples of this. In India, especially in the past, it was common for yogis to be able to do this. In our very theosophical history, Blavatsky performed these kind of precipitations many times, and we have objects in Adyar that were precipitated by Blavatsky in front of many witnesses. And all this is possible because, as Annie Besant says there are laws that rule all these things. Now, She says it is only through knowledge of how the laws work that we can learn how to deal with these worlds. And in the last sentence, she says that omniscience, meaning infinite knowledge, and omnipotence or omnipotence, meaning infinite power, are the same. Knowledge is power. That's a very common quote. So she says, in the mental and moral worlds, as much as in the physical, results can be foreseen, planned for, calculated on. Nature never betrays us. So that's the last paragraph that we read. So now the next aspect of the study that Annie Besant says is important before we can understand how karma works is the planes of nature. This idea that the cosmos is not only the physical plane, but that there are other dimensions that we were talking about. So Annie Besant says, to study the workings of karma on the lines suggested by the master, we must gain a clear conception of the three lower planes or regions of the universe and of the principles related to them. In practical occultism, the student learns to visit these planes and by his own investigations to transform theory into knowledge. So she's talking about the need to understand the three lower planes. In the Theosophical view, as you may know, there are said to be 7 planes constituting the cosmos, and the lower 3 planes are the planes that we, at this point in evolution, we experience more or less consciously. These are the physical plane, the emotional plane, and the mental plane. We are aware of the physical plane and we have self-awareness on the physical plane. We are aware of the emotional plane and we are aware of the mental plane, although we are aware of these 2 planes in a more indirect way. As evolution goes on, we can begin to relate to these planes in a more objective way and see the emotional or mental forms as we see the physical objects. But at this point, we are aware of these 3 dimensions to some extent. And Besant says that part of the idea in practical occultism is to do a research, like not too different from the scientific research, on all these hidden worlds in nature, so that whatever we learned first as a theory can be verified. This practical occultism in the Theosophical tradition is said to begin only when a person is ready to be a disciple of the Mahatmas, of the Masters of Wisdom, and that is a different subject that we are going to explore in one of these series in the future. But the idea here is that we first learn the theory, we then try to verify it as much as we can with our limited range of perception, but eventually we will be able to verify all these laws through our own senses, not only the physical senses, but superphysical senses. And Annie Besant is talking from what she has experienced, or at least to a large extent. So she provides this kind of table. There are different tables that can be used to show different aspects of this subject. There are 3 columns, one that is describing the planes, another one that describes the principles meaning the essential elements that constitute a human being. And the 3rd column is the vehicles of consciousness, meaning, let's say, the kind of bodies through which consciousness can express. So let us explore this briefly so that we can keep it in mind for our future exploration. We have the physical plane, which is the plane that we are aware of normally, this plane of objects and what we call matter. Now there are two principles, two elements, let's say, that are part of this physical plane. You have here the Sanskrit words. The lower one is the Stula Sharira, which is basically the physical matter. The physical matter made into a body. So this is what we call the physical body, the gross body that we all are aware of. Then there is another principle that is called Linga Sharira. The word Sharira means something like vehicle or body. This is a subtler counterpart of the physical body. It's normally in the Theosophical literature after Besant and Leadbeater, it's normally called the etheric double, and it's a subtle counterpart of the physical body through which energy flows. By energy I mean non-physical energy like prana, etc. And it's a bridge between the pranic forces, between life and the physical body. Then she talks about another plane, the astral plane or the psychic plane. This is also called sometimes the emotional plane. It's the place of emotions. And she describes a lower and a higher aspect of this plane. On the lower aspect, there is a principle that is called kama. Kama means desire, and this principle in human beings is the source of the instinctive reactions and the physiological needs and the more basic desires. And then on the higher psychic plane is kama manas. Manas is the Sanskrit name for the mind. So it's the mind that is entangled with desires and passions and instincts. The mind that is entangled with it is working on the higher psychic plane. And Annie Besant says that this forms a kind of subtle body. Later on it was called astral body, that actually in the course of evolution consciousness can use independently from the physical body. So then there is another plane that she calls here the Vachanic. Sometimes later on it was called the mental plane. The principle that works there is manas, like the mind, but the pure mind is on the mental plane. As we have said, when the mind is working entangled with the passions and desires, then that mind is working on a lower plane. But when we have a pure mind, a mind that is disentangled from this kamic aspect, then that is the mind that is on the mental plane. There are two bodies on this plane. This plane is also divided in two, higher and lower, but although Annie Besant didn't indicate it here. There is the mind body, or also called mental body, which is a vehicle of consciousness through which thinking happens. Right now, there is the mental body, my mental body, your mental body is active, producing the thinking, receiving the thinking, trying to understand the ideas. That's all done by the mental body or the mind body. And then there is a higher body, that is the causal body. The causal body could be seen as our soul. This is the vehicle of consciousness that is beyond life and death. In our previous At Home with Theosophy, we explored this to some level of detail when we studied the book Death and After. So all these four lower bodies, the gross body, the etheric double, the subtle body, and the mind body, they are eventually dissolved after a cycle of incarnation and the post-mortem process. But the causal body stays throughout most of the evolution of a human being. Eventually, it is also left behind, and consciousness stays in the spiritual body. So this is a mental plane, and the spiritual plane that she calls here Sushuptik. Sushupti is a Sanskrit word that is related to the different states of consciousness in Hinduism. We don't need to go into that. But later on it was normally called the Buddhic plane or the intuitional plane, for example. It's where the principle of buddhi is active. Buddhi, again, a Sanskrit word, comes from the root bud, which is also the root of the word Buddha, and it means awakened. So buddhi is the germ, the seed of awakening, is the innate wisdom that is in every human being, although we may not be aware of it, and therefore it looks like we don't have any wisdom. But wisdom is an intrinsic part of our nature, and part of the spiritual work is to awaken this wisdom that is in us. And there is a body also that consciousness can use as a vehicle, that is the spiritual body. And then there is Atman, which is the source of everything that we have discussed so far. The Atman is the fountain of all these differentiations and vehicles and states of consciousness and bodies, and is the foundation of it all. So Annie Besant said that we need to understand basically these three lower planes: the mental or the vachanic plane, the psychic, astral or emotional plane, and the physical plane. Now she describes a little the life that is on these planes, because each one of the planes has a life of its own, and a whole range of kingdoms of different forms of life. We are aware only of the physical forms of life, and we know there are animals and there are many different kinds of species of animals, and there are also plants and minerals and, well, human beings. The same happens with each of the planes. There are different kingdoms, different forms of life on each of the planes. So Annie Besant says, vast hierarchies of beings inhabit these planes, ranging from the lofty intelligences of the spiritual region to the lowest subconscious elementals of the physical world. On every plane, spirit and matter are conjoined in every particle having matter as its body, spirit as its life. No form exists which is not ensouled, the informing entity being either the loftiest intelligence, the lowest elemental, or any of the countless hosts that range between. So there is this idea that so far I have been focusing on the material aspect of the planes. I said that these planes are made of different kinds of matter, and that this matter follows different kinds of laws. But in the Theosophical view, there is never matter without some kind of consciousness, and there is never consciousness without some kind of matter. The only thing that is beyond consciousness and matter is the ultimate reality, Atman or Parabrahman at the universal level. And that cannot be said to be consciousness as we know it, or matter in the sense that we conceive it. But other than that, everything in the universe is manifests through these two aspects, consciousness and matter. So all the matter that is on the astral plane or on the mental plane are ensouled by entities, by forms of consciousness. It may be a very high, very spiritual form of consciousness, and then That's what religions call angels or devas, or it may be a very undeveloped form of consciousness, and that's what in some traditions they call nature spirits or the gnomes and seals, etc. These are forces, semi-conscious forces of nature that are part of how nature develops actually everything around, from the flowers and the rocks to how the physical bodies of animals and ours work, and even the other bodies, as we are going to see. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. So the basic idea here is that on each plane we have these two aspects, consciousness and matter, and that every form will have a kind of consciousness. And as we are going to see, this is important because we are constantly creating forms. So she goes on and says, the entities with which we shall presently be concerned are chiefly those of the psychic plane. For these give to man his body of desire, kama-rupa. So remember that we have these three lower planes, the physical, the psychic or astral, and the mental. Now she's going to focus now on the psychic plane, the middle plane between these three, because that was the plane in which the kamic principle was active. Remember that kama was this principle, the source of passions and desires and instincts. Higher feelings like love, compassion, they are all reflections on the lower planes from the spiritual principles. The appreciation of beauty, all these things are spiritual feelings, if you want to call them like that, as they are reflected on our emotional body. But the kamic principle is the source of those instincts that in an animal were useful to keep the animal alive, but when they become part of human beings, because we have a mind, those instincts are frequently grown. They frequently grow out of proportion. So, for example, aggression is something that is perfectly fine in itself and in the animal world is necessary to survive. But the animal is not aggressive without an immediate cause. If the animal has to fight for his life, he will do it. And then after that, that's the end of it. When that kamic principle begins to operate in human beings that have a mind, then the aggression takes a whole new dimension. And well, you can see the things that we do in the world, unfortunately. So Annie Besant says we are going to focus on this plane because the entities that ensoul the matter of this plane are the ones that generate this lower emotional body in ourselves. So let me read again the quote and go on. She says, these entities with which we shall presently be concerned are chiefly those of the psychic plane, for these give to man his body of desire, which in Sanskrit is called kama-rupa. These are indeed built into its astral matrix and vivify his astral senses. They are, to use the technical name, the form elementals, and the Sanskrit is rupa devatas, of the animal world, and are the agents of the changes which transmute vibration into sensation. Any being who possesses then a body into which these elementals are built is capable of feeling, and man feels through such a body. So let's see this concept that is very important. We talk about the physical body, and a few centuries ago there was no concept of the physical body being made of independent lives. lives that today we call cells. With the advance of science and medicine, we discovered that our body, which seems to be a unity, is actually made of innumerable cells, and these cells have their own activity. The, the proof that they have their own independent activity comes at the moment of death. When we die, the cells don't die. It's not that the cells die. It's not that the cells of the heart that stopped working are dead. On the contrary, they are as alive as always. Every single cell in our body is as alive as the second before what we call death came. But from the scientific point of view, it's a mystery why at a certain point all these cells that were working together stopped working together. In the Theosophical view, there is this idea that there is a higher law keeping the cells together. This higher law is manifested through what we call prana, or the life, and this higher law is bringing together all the cells. When that higher law is gone, then the cells begin to work independently. But they always have an independent consciousness. And it is through these cells that we perceive the world. For example, if the cells that compose the eyes, are not working properly, we may not be able to see colors or recognize colors. That is not a problem in consciousness. It's a problem in the vehicle of consciousness. In the same way, we have an emotional body that is formed by entities, just as the cells are entities. These entities are these elementals. So, according to the constitution of our emotional body, is how we are going to perceive the world emotionally. As Annie Besant explains there, these elementals, in the same way that the cells transform the food that we eat and make it into energy and into building blocks for the body, in the same way, these elementals transform the vibrations that are on the astral plane into an impression of consciousness that we call feeling or emotion. So this impression is mediated through the elementals that constitute our emotional body. That means that if the elementals are not, let's say, healthy, if the elementals are of a certain kind of quality, our consciousness, our pure awareness, will be exposed to a certain kind of emotional perception of the world. It's not a problem in consciousness. It's a problem in the vehicle of consciousness. At the same time, if the elementals that constitute the emotional body are of a different kind and constitute what we could call a healthy emotional body, then our consciousness will be able to perceive the world in a different way, because at that level, on the emotional level, consciousness perceives through the emotional body. On the mental level, consciousness perceives through the mental body. But of course, consciousness can perceive beyond these levels. But anyway, so far we have this concept of the elementals and how these elementals condition our relationship to the world. So Annie Besant goes on, the astral plane is thronged with elementals similar to those which enter into the desired body of man. By this department of his nature, man comes into immediate relations with these elementals. So through the emotional body, we are constantly in relationship with the elementals on the astral plane. And by them, he forms links with all the objects around him that are either attractive or repulsive to him. By his will, by his emotions, by his desires, he influences these countless beings which sensitively respond to all the thrills of feeling that he sends out in every direction. His own desired body acts as the apparatus. So this is a very interesting concept that she makes here, or she puts forward here. She says that through our emotional body, through the things that we like or dislike, or through these feelings, we generate links with the objects around. Because every object is informed by elementals too. Everything in nature has all these different levels of matter. So you see a physical object, but that physical object also has an astral counterpart and a mental counterpart. And these objects are, since we said that everything in nature has some kind of consciousness, these objects have some kind of consciousness. So when you have a feeling in relation to a particular object or person or situation, what happens is that there is an interchange of elementals between the object and yourself, and this interchange generates a link. This is actually how science is discovering that the quantum world works, because there are, I don't want to go too deep into this, but there is the idea that there are some subatomic particles that constitute matter and some other subatomic particles that constitute forces. And the forces are simply the exchange of this kind of particles between two bodies that are made of matter particles. So the forces are just the exchange of a particular kind of particles, and that generates a link. This is the same that Annie Besant was explaining here. Whenever we have an emotional reaction to something, we generate a link. This is why in the Theosophical teachings it is said that love and hate bind the person with the same intensity. And this is why in the spiritual life it's important to develop little by little a state of equanimity. We are going to deal with that later on. So once we understand these basic principles, that there are laws that are ruling the emotional activity, the mental activity, and these laws have a lot to do with the elementals. And once we understand that there are different dimensions in the universe, and that every feeling that we have, if we focus on the emotional or astral plane, every feeling that we have, we are actually activating a certain kind of energy, which is in itself matter and consciousness. Once we understand this, we are ready to see how karma is created from a certain point of view. Annie Besant, in explaining the generation of thought forms, says, "We are now in a position to more clearly understand the Master's words. The mind, working in the subtle matter of the higher psychic plane," remember there were two planes, the lower psychic plane that was the kamic region, and the higher psychic plane that was kama manas, the mind that is entangled with the passions. So the mind working in the subtle matter of the higher psychic plane generate images, thought forms. Imagination has very accurately been called the creative faculty of the mind. And it is so in a more literal sense than many may suppose who use the phrase. This image-making capacity is the characteristic power of the mind. There is a question from Roger. Let me see if we can address it now or later. He says, "You said that the elementals of the object and the elementals of the person interact. How did the elementals become associated with the object? Does the object have an image on the emotional plane?" Yes, well, every object has astral matter or emotional matter, if we want to call it that way. I mean, it's astral matter, but in human beings it's the vehicle of emotions, so that's why we can call it also emotional matter. And the the object can be vivified, if we want to put it in that way, by our own relationship with the object. We establish a connection and we establish this interchange of elementals. So in time, objects, at the very beginning, the objects don't necessarily have any elemental associated unless it is an object that was created by human beings. Or, well, it's a little more complex than that. The nature spirits are associated to the natural elements. Now, if it is an object that human beings created, the intention that was developed or was active when generating the object can produce or can infuse certain elementals in the object. But in time, as the object is being used and is in constant interaction with human beings, there are more and more elementals that are being embedded in the object because of the feelings and thoughts that we have in regards to the object. So today, different objects have a very specific energy that was produced by us, like money has a very specific energy, or a cross in a church has a very specific energy. This is all due to how we relate to the objects. And then it's a circle, because we project elementals into the object, and then the object becomes more and more alive, so to say, and it can also attract the elementals that are in our constitution that can be in tune with the elementals in the particular object. So we are going to explore. Annie Besant will explain all this to a good level of detail. So let us go on with the quote. She was saying here that when we think, we actually produce a form. If you are a clairvoyant and you can see the higher psychic plane, you can see these thought forms that have been called in the Theosophical literature. And when we produce an idea, we put out a certain energy that attracts mental or the astral and mental matter around this idea, and because this is all vibration, that matter generates a form that is the result of the kind of vibration that our thinking and feeling had. So you can see people actually generating forms as they feel and think, and this is what Annie Besant says, that imagination is not merely a fancy, but whenever we imagine something or think something, we are producing a form. So she says, an idea, a mental image, is a complicated thing and needs perhaps a whole sentence to describe it accurately. A speaker puts into words such parts of his mental pictures as he can, and these words call up in the hearer's mind pictures corresponding to those in the mind of the speaker. The mind deals with the pictures, the images, not with the words. So she is explaining a fact in psychology. Words are only symbols that we use to stimulate certain mental images in people around. Now she says, in regions where the mind speaks to mind, this would be when the communication happens on the physical, on the mental plane and not on the physical plane. So in regions where mind speaks to mind, there is perfect expression, far beyond anything words may convey. A thought form then is a mental image created or molded by the mind out of the subtle matter of the higher psychic plane, in which, as above said, it works. So a mental image generates, as we said, a form with the astral matter. This form, composed of the rapidly vibrating atoms of the matter of that region, sets up vibrations all around it. As the thought form passes passes outward outside the field of consciousness or sinks downward, if we have the kind of table that she was showing, when it goes from the higher psychic plane to the lower and then to the physical, these vibrations thrill out as a singing color in every direction and call to the thought form the elementals belonging to that color. So she's explaining here a fact that is known to clairvoyants and to several traditions, that every thought and emotion produces a vibration that manifests on the psychic planes as color and as music too, as a sound. So whenever we think, we produce colors and sound. Obviously not physical colors and not physical sounds, but what would be the representation or the correspondence of colors and sounds on the psychic planes. And this is an important fact because, as we are going to see, that is the language of elementals. Elementals follow colors, or what we call colors on the psychic plane, and sounds. This is, by the way, why things like mantras or visualizations have an effect. So she says the hue of the singing color depends on the nature of the motive inspiring the generator of the thought form. So what kind of color or sound it produces depends on the motivation that produced this thought. If the motive be pure, loving, beneficent in its character, the color produced will summon to the thought form an elemental, which will take on the characteristics impressed on the form by the motive and act along the line thus traced. This elemental enters into the thought form, playing to it the part of a soul, and thus an independent entity is made in the astral world, an entity of a beneficent character. So this is how thought forms are created. We think of something, we produce a mental image, that mental image generates a form on the astral plane, a material form, and then it attracts an elemental that is in tune with that kind of thought, with that the kind of thought or feeling that produced the form. So this elemental becomes the soul in the thought form that would be the body. And it becomes an active entity. This is why prayers can help people, or sending good thoughts can actually, or when we send good thoughts, we are actually sending something objective to people, because there is this conjunction between the form that we create and the elemental that ensouls that form, and that thought form can last as an entity on the astral plane for a while, depending on how strongly we have produced this form. If the motive, on the other hand, be impure, revengeful, maleficent in its character, the color produced will summon to the thought form an elemental which will equally take on these characteristics and act along the line thus traced. For example, an angry thought will cause a flash of red. That flash of red is a summons to the elementals, and they sweep in the direction of the summoner, and one of them enters into the thought form, which gives it an independent activity of a destructive, disintegrating type. Men are continually talking in this color language quite unconsciously, and thus calling round them these swarms of elementals, who take up their abodes in the various thought forms provided. Thus, it is that a man peoples his current in space with a world of his own, crowded with the offspring of his fancies, desires, impulses, and passions. Angels and demons of our own creating throng round us on every side, makers of will and woe to others, bringers of weal and woe to ourselves. Verily, a karmic host. So this is how Annie Besant presents the way in which we generate a karmic host. In the next week, we are going to explore how this becomes the vehicle of karma. But the idea is that everything that we think or feel generates a kind of entity. This entity stays around us in our aura, let's say, and it's there always trying to establish connections with similar things. Just as in the physical plane, we have this idea that the idea of magnetism, that there is a certain attraction between certain objects. In the same way, these elementals and thought forms produced generate a magnetic attraction to similar kind of energies. And these are going to be the vehicles for what we call karma. So this is what I wanted to present today. This is trying to establish the foundations for a deeper understanding of karma. And then, of course, we will also include in our discussion how to work with all this. When we see how things work, some of us may feel appalled to the idea that we are producing these entities. But the truth is that this is how we normally live, whether we know it or not. It's not that this is now a new fact all of a sudden because we have read it from here. This is how we live, and but knowing about this, we can work little by little in an intelligent way to try to reshape our atmosphere, our psychological or our astral atmosphere, so that we can try to generate a good vehicle for the awareness that is trying to express through these different vehicles of consciousness. So is there any comments or questions that you want to make at this point? You can raise your hand as Roger is doing. If you don't know how to do it, next week you can sign in a little earlier and Jim will explain it to you. Go ahead, Roger. Yes, I'm hearing you.
You can hear me? Okay. Sorry for the clock. So the thought forms that we create and are inhabited by elementals, what happens to those when we transition from this earthly plane? I know I'm getting ahead a little bit, but in general, do they retain their energy or do they dissipate and die?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. All these things will last for a particular amount of time and then eventually dissipate. And how long they will last depends on how strong or how much energy our awareness put into them. We are going to talk about this later, but the identification with emotions and with thoughts is or establishes a kind of connection between our awareness and these thought forms and these elementals. So the very identification gives them strength and produces this link between the elementals and ourselves. But once we die, there is this whole process after death on the astral plane where all these elementals are, and they become the new body of the person, what is called kamarupa in Theosophy. So after death, we become wrapped around these elementals that we have generated during our life, and these skandhas. We are going to see that a little later, but skandhas are like habits of thinking and feeling. So we are wrapped by them, and we can only perceive the world through them. And this is why we create our hell or heaven, because if a person was constantly feeding very strong anger or very strong lower passions, when the person dies, all that the person can perceive are these kind of emotions. So he will feel in a constant place of anger or a constant place of sadness or whatever it was that it was created. So until all these elementals little by little die, they weaken and die away, and then consciousness can get out of the astral body and go into higher planes. So all these elementals will stay with us after death. They become very relevant after death, and this is why it is important to work during our daily life, so that after death we don't get trapped into this kind of elementals. If during our daily life we attracted more spiritual elementals, so to say, and if we didn't identify with them too much, then consciousness can escape this kama rupa that is created quite fast, and there, there is no need to stay on the astral plane or to be in touch with disturbing emotions. But they do stay with us, and they will last longer or shorter time according to the identification that we have with them and how strong we have made them. Any other comments or questions? You can either type in the chat box or raise your hand and I'll give you the microphone. Okay, so we will explore, as I said, for a few weeks this book. In this week, if you want to do something more or less practical, begin to try to be aware of the kind of thoughts and emotions that you are generating, and just pay some attention so that you begin to see how this works, and this will be useful in the future to be able to use these laws that Annie Besant is talking about. So for this week, you could do that if you feel like trying to use this knowledge in some way. Be aware, begin to see how your emotions or thoughts link you to things, to either because you like them or you don't like them. So if there is no other question or comment, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week. Have a great week, and today was Adyar Day, so have a good rest of the Adyar Day. Bye-bye.